Okay, so the ghost of Richard Harris. Do you think that a man with a reputation and a public image, such as Richard Harris, would achieve such fame and reverence today? And what do you think are the positive and negative connotations of this?
To be honest with you, I think people are of their period. And so somebody like Richard lived in the 60s, where, Sandy Leverson, his agent, says, where, bad behavior in many ways and being drunk and whatever was part of the what was in some ways expected of certain types of actors and performers. And so you had these great actors like Richard Burton, Peter O'Toole, Oliver Reed to a certain extent, that lived a life that was not the type of life that you would live today. So I think Richard wouldn't have existed. I think he would be very uncomfortable as a young man, certainly in today's world, because his behavior was quite extreme, and Hollywood was totally looking at male supremacy in some ways. You did have the occasional actor like Elizabeth Taylor with Cleopatra that would really, and some great performances, but at the same time it was, as we've found out, male-centric. Harris, though, I think was an interesting man, because although he was quite contrary and would potentially rile against political correctness, he was quite honourable in the way that he approached certain things. So he played the big bad wolf, but he wasn't, for me, he wasn't really. So I wasn't worried about finding out myself making a film about somebody whose behavior had crossed the line. I don't think he ever did. I think he was pretty noble with his approach to women. I think his behavior was over the top as a man, but that was half, to me in a way, half his charm, and he enters in history in that manner as somebody that lived a big life.
Okay, in your director's statement, you say that you wanted to go beyond the image of Hellraiser, just like you spoke now. Do you believe you succeeded? And what were the most surprising things you discovered about Richard Harris?
I think that, whether we went beyond the Hellraiser, I don't know, because I think that, I found these tapes when Richard did a show where he goes around after Camelot, and in the early 70s he does a show where he goes and sings. He's become and he reads poetry and he tells stories. And the tape that I discovered is he did the promo for it, and he said, my name's Richard Harris, I'm coming to your town and I'm going to tell you some lies about myself. And I felt Richard was often doing that. He was telling big stories, tall tales, he was entertaining, he was a great person on chat shows. I actually was more interested in the complexity of his mind. I think he had a great mind, and I think that he was much more intelligent than he often put out, and I think he had a love of poetry and words, and I wanted to show him as a real person and somebody that was honest with the things that made him successful and not. And he says right at the beginning of the movie, I've had fame, I've had success, I've had great failures, and none of them are important. And I thought that was a good message that's still relevant today.
I like that you mentioned how it was actually his words that were very important for you to put on screen, because I thought they were the most touching as well. Sorry, let me just figure
Yeah, dude, you can cut this. You can edit me.
I hope so. I'm just sending it on. And
Yeah. They'll edit it really well.
Yeah, I can't do everything.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Oh, yeah. So I found the scenes with Harris's sons in that storage facility to be some of the most poignant in the film. What are some moments from shooting that stand out to you?
Yeah, those were important, because you got the boys looking through their father's stuff.
And they looked really cold.
And they were cold, and they all had those little hats on. And then Damien got very emotional and started crying, and you couldn't really understand why, because there's like often when you lose a parent, there's a lot of unexpressed things, and then suddenly something will trigger you. And I thought he was very honest in that moment, and I found it to be very interesting. I found taking the journey, I think, to Ireland is the thing that I found most interesting. I found Kilkee fascinating, that this young man had actually originally seen himself as an athlete. You know, he was a young guy playing these rackets, and I wanted to show that young men still do that. So it was quite important for me not to just have shots of Richard with a racket and saying he was a great racket player, but to show you young guys doing it now. Even with the person that played the young Richard Harris, he swam across that bay for me, you know, and the guy dove into the sea. And I think that was a spirit of youthful excitement about life ahead. And then it contrasted with when he shot the field and he was this older man and he was reclaiming his career because it was in the doldrums. He was doing terrible movies and he wasn't taking it seriously and he was taking paychecks. So I thought that, to me, going up there, the beauty of Ireland and the fact that you can find somebody that has passed away in the landscape was significant.
Do you have any connections to Ireland yourself?
I did, well, my mother actually, on my mother's side, has an Irish background, but she was somebody in the 50s that worked for the colonial service and adopted an English accent, and so Ireland was pushed to what, you know, push back. The relationship between the English and the Irish has been complicated, but I certainly developed a love of Ireland by doing this film.
Because there is a point in the film where you mentioned that, or where there's a clip from Richard Harris saying that when he was in a fight, he was Irish, but when he won an award...
He made that a joke and he kept doing it, but it was true.
Oh, it still is, I think.
You know, Andy Williams, the host of the Golden Globes, said he's a great English actor. But, you know, often the Irish were regarded as second-class citizens. And again, I felt that was hugely significant, you know. There was always a thing where apparently Harris, when he first came to London and he was a student, wanted to rent a room. And in one of the rooms, there was a sign saying, you know, no blacks, no Irish.
No blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
No blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Well
I lived
done.
in Ireland for 7 years. So.
And he put his fist through that you know. We didn't use that story, but he was certainly, you know, in his early part of his career, really pushing, and he was very political. I thought that was like Marlon Brando. You know, Brando and Harris had a very close relationship, and I didn't have time to get into it, but they knew each other well. Harris loved him as a young boy and had acted out as Leela Doolan, this great producer who's still around. You know, in our movie we have all these 90-year-olds, Malachi McCaw, and their brains are still very active, and it was great to have them. And but Brando and Harris came across each other quite a few times in their careers and sparred. But they're very similar characters. They're these actors, but not necessarily they're more than just an actor, you know.
Yeah.
There's something about them that makes them really interesting people, you know, flaws and all.
Yeah, and it probably makes them very good actors.
Yeah,
as well at the same
I think
time.
the complexity of their natures gave them lots to draw on.
Yeah.
It's true.
There were many people in the film recounting their memories about Richard Harris, and obviously most of them remember the crazy nights out and so on. How did you approach these statements in order them not to overpower the search for the man behind the image?
Yeah, well, you know, Richard did have crazy nights out, and, you know, I really wanted to do that, and he had this lost weekend, this strange trip on a plane and we had these photographs and we brought that to life. But I think that was, a lot of it was in his younger days, you know, and I think it was part of his story. And I approached it like a movie, you know. I wanted to have scenes, and then you move on from that scene, and not necessarily always chronological. So they act as scenes, you know, whether you're in a Rolls Royce with the Sons, or whether you're talking to Jimmy Webb, talking about his relationship with him when they were doing music together, or indeed when he's gallivanting around Europe on a private jet. You know, I didn't want to say what I thought myself. I wanted Richard to have the opportunity to, and the audience to see and make their own decisions of what they thought of him. I'm curious about whether people will like him. Whether, you know, I thought I was very keen to get as many women as possible, because the idea of this masculine man, but actually, you know, Leela Doolan, who was the first person in you know, that appears and tells the story. Then you have Stephen Ray, but you had a lot, and then you know, a lot of balance between the sexes. Richard was not somebody that judged people in that way. I thought that was interesting about him as well.
It's a very interesting like a decision to make
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Did you find that hindered you?
No,
Or challenge?
The challenge was whether people that knew him well were still alive. You know, there were people like Mickey Rourke that wanted to do it, and it just didn't work out. He had a house next to Richard, and Richard had been giving him advice about how to deal with Hollywood, and Richard had, but that didn't pan out. But I was very happy with the cast, and at one stage I thought I'm going to have the oldest cast in the history of documentary making. You know, Maliki is 91, I think. Leela is 90. You know, the guys in their 70s were spring chickens. You know, even the brothers are older. So I was worried about whether it would feel real now, and whether we would have that depth. I think Russell Crowe was great too.
I loved that story actually.
Yeah.
I thought it was, to me, it was actually the one that described Harris most.
Do you know what was so great about it? Russell was generous. It was a little bit, I felt a little bit like Moby Dick, trying to get him, because he's a very famous guy, he's very busy. Why would he want to do a documentary about his friend who died 20 years ago? And, you know, but he obviously had a respect for him. And then what he said was really pertinent, because Russell wasn't talking about him and Joaquin as movie stars. They were real people working together, and Richard was this figure that had a fatherly kind of openness, and they connected. And I thought that Russell was, that's why I let him say what he does. I thought if anyone deserves to give a sum up of Richard, saying he was an authentic man, I felt that's what I felt. And that's the art of documentary making. You know, if you're not putting yourself in it, like a Nick Broomfield does, where he gives that, or even Werner Herzog, who is the best documentary maker working today and filmmaker of great note. But my stuff is often about trying to let the person speak for themselves. So whether it be Anthony Hopkins or Steve Martin, who's amazing, it's their story. It may be my take on their life, but they're still telling it. And I try not to let myself appear, because I try to be honest to who I think their best selves are.
It sounds to me almost like you're a prison, and their light goes through and it comes out on
In
screen.
some ways, and certainly with Harris, there's a lot coming through, you know.
Absolutely.
You know.
Which of his achievements would you single out as most relevant?
Well, I mean, it would be over-emotional to say as a father, because I think that he wasn't a great father. I think that in some ways, although the sons are very respectful of their memory of their dad, you know, like my father, I went to school with those guys, not at the same time, but we were all went off to school very early. Richard's relationships were with other people until he was older, and I think that his ability to focus in on a part and bring it to life when it really meant something to him. So there's certain roles that you can go back to. You know, you've got to watch Sporting Life, you've got to watch The Field. You know, those are roles that show the power of him. But also being himself. I think it's very hard to be oneself in this day and age with the media, you know. And he was, when Russell says he's authentic, Richard Harris was who he was, and was very keen to be that person. Love him or loathe him, you know.
It's very valuable, you're right. All right, one last one, if I'm not mistaken.
This is great. I'm enjoying it. Yeah,
I'm enjoying this
It's good to
as
talk.
well.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Last one, not necessarily connected to the film, but maybe one that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
They say that all spheres of filmmaking are being threatened by, or even surpassed by streamers. And I'm wondering, what's your opinion of them? Because I find that they actually allow you to come into more things, documentaries as well. Do you see them as a welcome disruptor, a new opportunity, or a threat?
I think I've got mixed feelings in connection with cinema, because I was a school projectionist at school, so I used to love, and
they're dying out.
Yeah, and I loved Cinema Paradiso, and the idea that cinema has a magic, and that a dark room, you go into it, and like theatre, literally something opens. For me, the sound of the film itself spooling away is really important. I do think the experience of sharing cinema in a room amongst others is invaluable. I think that it's amazing that Venice has this cinema section. And I was so pleased out of all the festivals to be invited to come here, because I think Harris was about cinema too. Now, that's not to say that I don't think something like Netflix or the streamers have helped keep cinema alive, because everything changes. Film doesn't exist as we don't shoot on film, we shoot digitally now. However, the language of cinema is still there, and you take White Noise or whatever, which is a Netflix film, and it will go very quickly, or 13 Lies, this great film by Ron Howard about the kids that were stuck in the... I watched that, and I thought it was really dynamic, even on a TV screen. I would love to see people have their own little cinemas and create that space, but I think it's just the nature of how things move. I hope cinema remains, I really do. And I hope that, yeah, the streamers seem to be in a dialogue to respect that. So I think the two can exist together. That's the ideal, because there's much more money in streamers because we all subscribe, and fewer people are unfortunately going to cinema. But I think places like Venice and even this documentary, I shot it as a movie. I didn't want it to be 4:3, like a TV screen, or even 16:9. I wanted it to be wider, and that's what we did. And people were worried that we'd have too much black space, but I don't care, because I think people immediately think they're in a movie when they see that.
Yeah.
They see that experience and the ratio, and they think cinema. And you go into, you accept much more. So even for documentary, feature documentary, yes. So that's possibly my answer to that one.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I
good.
love it. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
And we've come to the end. I was
Thank
giving
you.
my 3-minute warning.
Yeah. Did
so-
you like the film?
Yes.